The bridge of the ESS Defiance was dark except for the red emergency lights that cast long shadows across the damaged control panels. Captain Daniel Hayes stood near the main viewport and watched as another explosion tore through the hull of a nearby human transport ship. He could do nothing to help them. His own ship was barely holding together after the battle with the Crythian war fleet. The viewport showed the cold darkness of space and the distant blue glow of Jupiter, where their base waited on Europa. They had to get there before the Crythians found them again. Behind him, Lieutenant Amy Carter worked at the engineering console with her hands moving fast across the controls. She was trying to keep the engines running long enough to reach safety. Her face showed the exhaustion they all felt after 3 days of running and fighting. The ship shook as another system failed and the lights flickered. Daniel heard her curse under her breath as she rerouted power from the damaged sections. She had been working without sleep since the battle, started and refused to rest until they reached. Europa Commander Jake Morrison sat at the tactical station and studied the sensor readings with tired eyes that missed nothing. He was tracking every Crythian ship in the system and plotting their movements. The enemy had them surrounded, but there were still gaps in their formation. If they could find the right moment, they might slip through. He looked up at Daniel and shook his head slowly. The Crythians were tightening the net with each passing hour. The crew moved quietly through their duties and spoke in low voices when they had to speak at all. Everyone knew how bad things were. They had lost more than half the defense fleet in the last battle. Earth was under constant bombardment and the colonies were gone. Mars had fallen 2 months ago, and the last transmission from the surface had been a distress call that ended in static. Venus Station was destroyed. Titan Base went dark 3 weeks before. Only Europa remained and the Crythians were coming for it too. Dr. Lisa Park entered the bridge from the medical bay, and her uniform was stained with blood that was not her own. She had been operating for 14 hours straight, and saved everyone she could, but many had died anyway. She walked to Daniel and handed him a data pad with the casualty report. He did not want to look at it, but he had to know. 63 dead and another 40 wounded. From a crew of 200, that was a heavy loss. He signed the report and gave it back to her. She touched his shoulder briefly, then returned to her patients without a word. The comm system crackled and Admiral Frank Coleman's voice came through from Europa. The transmission was weak and filled with interference, but they could understand him. He told Daniel to come in fast and not worry about the docking procedures. The base was preparing for evacuation and time was running out. The Crythians would reach Europa in less than 48 hours and they could not hold against a full assault. Daniel acknowledged the order and told Amy to push the engines, as hard as she could. As the Defiance moved closer to Jupiter, the crew could see the massive gas giant filling the viewport with its storms and colored bands. Europa was a small white dot against that enormous backdrop. It looked peaceful from here, but Daniel knew the moon was full of desperate people preparing for the worst. The base housed 20,000 souls, and most of them were civilians. Families of the fleet personnel and refugees from the fallen colonies. If the base fell, there would be nowhere else to run. The ship shuddered as Amy forced more power from the damaged engines. Jake called out that he was detecting Crythian scouts near the outer moons. They had minutes before they were spotted. Daniel ordered the crew to battle stations even though everyone was already at their posts. It was habit more than anything else. The weapons officer reported that they had less than 30% ammunition remaining. The shield generator was offline. One good hit would tear them apart. Amy announced that she was ready to engage the stealth system. It was experimental technology that had never been tested in real combat. The scientists said it would mask their energy signature for about 20 minutes. After that, the system would burn out and they would be visible again. Daniel gave the order and the ship seemed to fade from existence as the stealth field activated. The Crythian scouts passed within a few kilometers, but their sensors showed nothing. The Defiance drifted past them like a ghost. Europa Station appeared on the main screen as a collection of domes and towers built into the ice. Docking bay doors opened to receive them and the ship slipped inside with seconds to spare before the stealth system failed. The doors closed behind them and gravity pulled the ship down to the landing pad. The engines finally gave out with a grinding sound that echoed through the hull. Amy sagged in her chair and allowed herself to breathe. They had made it home. Daniel left the bridge and walked through the corridors toward the airlock. His crew was already moving to disembark and get the wounded to the medical facilities. He could hear the sounds of the station beyond the hull. People running and shouting. Equipment being moved. Children crying. The base was in chaos as everyone prepared for the evacuation that might be their last chance. The airlock opened, and Admiral Coleman was waiting with a group of officers. He was an old man with white hair and a face lined by years of command. He looked at the Defiance and the damage it had suffered, and something sad crossed his expression. He had known this ship when it was new and gleaming. Now it was a wreck held together by determination and desperation. He turned to Daniel, and they saluted each other in the formal way of the fleet. The Admiral told Daniel to come with him immediately. There was something important that could not wait. They walked through the crowded corridors of the station while people pressed against the walls to let them pass. Families huddled together with their belongings in small bundles. Soldiers checked weapons and armor. Engineers worked on the defense systems, knowing they would not be enough. Daniel saw fear in every face, but also determination. Humanity was down, but not finished yet. They entered the command center, where a holographic display showed the tactical situation. It was worse than Daniel had imagined. Crithian fleets surrounded the entire solar system in 3 massive formations. Earth was cut off and dying slowly under the orbital strikes. The last resistance on the surface would not last another week. Lunabase had gone silent. The belt colonies were abandoned. There was nowhere left to run and nothing left to fight with except one battered battlecruiser and a few dozen support ships. Admiral Coleman activated a secure channel, and the display changed to show something unexpected. It was a star chart with a region marked far beyond the edge of known space. He explained that a deep space probe had found something in that empty region. Ancient ruins on a dead world, structures that predated all known civilizations. The probe's last transmission included scans that showed active power readings from technology millions of years old. Technology that might give humanity one last chance. Daniel understood what was being asked before the Admiral spoke the words. Someone had to take a ship through Crithian space and reach those ruins. Someone had to find that ancient technology and bring it back. It was suicide. The odds of success were nearly zero. The Crithians controlled every jump point and patrol route between here and there. Even if a ship could get through, the journey would take weeks, and they might not have weeks. The Admiral looked at Daniel with tired eyes that had seen too much death and asked if he would take the mission. There was no one else. The Defiance was the only ship that could make the journey. Daniel looked at the star chart and thought about his crew. They had already given so much. He thought about Earth burning in space and the people on Europa who would die when the Crithians came. He thought about humanity's last days and whether they would end in surrender or defiance. He told the Admiral he would go. They would leave as soon as the ship could be repaired enough to fly. Admiral Coleman nodded slowly and placed a data chip in Daniel's hand. It contained all the probe's information and the coordinates to the ancient world. He said something about hope and sacrifice, but Daniel was already thinking about the mission. He left the command center and headed back to his ship to tell the crew. They deserved to know what was being asked of them. They deserved the choice, even if there was really no choice at all. Behind him, Europa Station continued its preparations, and above them in the dark, the Crithians drew closer with each passing hour. The repairs took 18 hours, and during that time, Daniel gathered his senior officers in the briefing room. Amy Carter arrived first with grease still on her hands from working in the engine room. Jake Morrison came next, carrying a data pad filled with tactical projections. Dr. Lisa Park was the last to enter, and she looked like she had not slept since they arrived. Daniel sealed the door and activated the privacy field that would keep their conversation secure. He explained the mission without softening the truth. They would travel through the Ashara Nebula, where sensors barely worked, and navigation was almost impossible. The nebula was filled with Crithian patrol routes and ancient wrecks from ships that had tried to cross it before. If they survived that, they would reach coordinates in uncharted space where ruins waited with technology that might save humanity. The odds were bad, but they were the only odds left. Amy listened and calculated numbers in her head about fuel and engine stress and how long the ship could last. She said the Defiance could make the journey if they were careful and lucky. Jake studied his tactical data and pointed out 17 different ways they could die before reaching the nebula. Lisa asked about the ruins and what they might find there. Daniel admitted he did not know. The probe data was incomplete and filled with readings that made no sense. Something old waited there, and that was all anyone could say for certain. The officers looked at each other, and Daniel saw them making the same choice he had made. There was fear in their eyes, but also something stronger. They had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. Amy said her team would have the engines ready in 4 hours. Jake said he would plot the safest course through the nebula, which meant the least dangerous course because nothing about this journey would be safe. Lisa said she would prepare medical supplies for an extended mission. They would go together into the dark and either find hope or find their end. Daniel dismissed them and returned to the bridge where the crew was working on final repairs. Technician Paul Grant was replacing burned circuit boards with parts salvaged from damaged fighters. He was young and talented and worked with steady hands even though he knew what they were about to attempt. Officer Nina Walsh sat at the navigation console and ran simulations trying to find a path through the nebula. She had been born on a colony ship and learned to read space like others read books. If anyone could guide them through it would be her. Admiral Coleman came aboard one last time before they departed. He walked through the ship and spoke to the crew members he passed. He told them they were humanity's best hope, and their sacrifice would be remembered. Some of the younger crew members looked proud at his words, but the veterans knew better. They would only be remembered if someone survived to tell the story. The Admiral found Daniel in his quarters and they shared a drink in silence. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said. The Defiance undocked from Europa Station 6 hours later and moved away from the moon with its engines running quiet. The stealth system activated one last time, and the ship faded from sensors as it slipped past the Crithian blockade. Daniel watched Jupiter fall away behind them and wondered if he would ever see Sewell again. The crew was silent at their stations. Everyone understood that the easy part was over. Now came the real test. They reached the edge of the Ashara Nebula 3 days later. The view screen showed a massive cloud of gas and dust that stretched across millions of kilometers. Colors swirled in patterns that hurt to watch. Gravitational anomalies twisted space into knots. Old shipwrecks drifted in the outer edges like warnings to those who approached. Nina took a deep breath and began plotting their course into that nightmare. The Defiance entered the nebula and immediately the sensors went mad. Readings flickered and changed. The navigation system struggled to maintain a fix on their position. Outside the viewport, the nebula closed around them like fog. Amy reported that they were getting strange energy readings from deeper inside, but she could not identify the source. Jake kept weapons ready even though they could barely see 100 meters in any direction. They traveled for 2 days through the murk and saw things that should not exist. Massive structures of unknown origin floated in the gas, energy patterns that might be living things or might be sensor ghosts. The wreckage of ships from a dozen different species, including some that humans had never encountered. Nina guided them around the worst of the gravitational wells, but even her skill could not avoid everything. The ship shook and groaned as space itself tried to tear them apart. On the 3rd day in the nebula, they detected another ship. Jake identified it as a Crithian patrol cruiser, and it was close. Too close. The aliens had not seen them yet, but that would change in minutes. Daniel faced an impossible choice. If they ran, the Crithians might track them and discover their destination. If they hid, the patrol might still find them. If they fought, they might alert other enemy ships in the area. He made the decision that seemed least bad and ordered an attack. The Defiance powered weapons and dropped stealth. The tactical computer locked onto the Crithian ship. Amy diverted power from life support to the guns. Jake coordinated the firing solution. The first volley caught the enemy by surprise and tore through their shields. The patrol cruiser tried to turn and bring its own weapons to bear, but Nina put the Defiance exactly where it needed to be. The second volley crippled the enemy engines, but the Crithians were not finished. Their ship activated emergency thrusters and rammed toward the Defiance. The impact threw everyone against their restraints. Alarms screamed as hull breaches opened in 3 sections. The enemy ship locked onto their hull with magnetic clamps. Jake reported boarding parties cutting through the outer doors. Daniel called for Sergeant Kevin Brooks and his Marines. Kevin arrived on the bridge within seconds with his squad ready for combat. He was a hard man who had fought Crithians on a dozen worlds. His face showed no fear, only cold determination. Daniel told him to repel boarders, and Kevin acknowledged with a nod. He led his team toward the breach points where the aliens were cutting through. The sound of energy weapons echoed through the corridors as the battle moved inside the ship. The fighting was brutal and close. Crithians were stronger and faster than humans, but the Marines had trained for this. They used the ship's layout against the invaders. Narrow corridors became kill zones. Emergency bulkheads trapped alien soldiers in sections that were then vented to space. Kevin and his team fought with creativity and rage that the Crithians could not match. They turned the ship itself into a weapon. On the bridge, Amy rerouted power to the damaged sections and tried to separate from the enemy vessel. The magnetic clamps held firm. Jake coordinated with Kevin's team and directed them to the clamp control systems. If they could reach the enemy ship's bridge, they might be able to release the locks. Lisa prepared medical supplies and waited for the wounded that would surely come. Kevin led a counterboarding action, and his team cut through into the Crithian ship. The aliens fell back in confusion. They had expected humans to defend but not to attack. The Marines pushed forward through corridors designed for beings larger than themselves. They reached the enemy bridge and fought the command crew in hand-to-hand combat. Kevin personally killed the Crithian captain and forced the surrender of the survivors. With the enemy ship under control, Amy was able to release the magnetic clamps. The Defiance pulled away from the crippled patrol cruiser. Jake wanted to destroy it, but Daniel ordered them to leave it drifting. The Crithians inside were no longer a threat. Kevin brought back prisoners, including the ship's science officer who might have useful information. The cost had been high. 7 Marines dead and 15 wounded. The ship had new hull breaches that would take hours to repair. Lisa examined the Crithian prisoners in the medical bay. They were tall and covered in armored scales. Their eyes showed intelligence and something else: fear. She ran scans and studied their biology, looking for any advantage humans might exploit. What she found was unexpected. The Crithian brain structure showed rigid patterns. They thought in hierarchies and predetermined responses. Human neural pathways were chaotic by comparison, random, unpredictable. She realized that was why the aliens feared them. Humans did not fit into any category the Crithians understood. She brought her findings to Daniel. He studied the data and began to see a strategy forming. If Crithians could not handle unpredictability, then humanity's greatest weakness might be their greatest strength. Chaos and creativity against order and doctrine. It gave him an idea about how they might use the ancient technology when they found it. If they found it, the Defiance continued through the nebula for another 5 days. The crew worked constantly to repair damage and maintain systems. Paul Grant practically lived in the engine room. Nina barely slept as she navigated through impossible space. The ship held together through determination and improvisation. On the 10th day since entering the nebula, they emerged on the far side. The sensors cleared and showed open space ahead. In the distance, a star system waited. The navigation computer confirmed they had reached the coordinates. Somewhere in that system was the ancient world and the ruins that might save them all. Daniel ordered the crew to prepare for whatever came next. The planet appeared on the view screen like something from a dream. It was larger than Earth, with continents covered in crystalline structures that caught the light from its sun and scattered it into rainbow patterns. The ruins stretched as far as the sensors could detect. Towers reached into the upper atmosphere. Bridges connected floating platforms that defied gravity. Whatever race built this place had commanded powers beyond human understanding. Dr. Henry Kim stood on the bridge and stared at the planet with tears in his eyes. He was an old man who had spent his entire life studying fragments and hints of ancient civilizations. Now he looked at an intact city that had stood for millions of years. His hands shook as he adjusted his glasses. He said it was impossible, but here it was anyway. Daniel told him to prepare a landing party. They would find out soon enough what secrets the ancients had left behind. The ship moved into orbit and Amy ran detailed scans. She reported that the ruins were generating power. Active energy signatures came from deep within the structures. Something down there was still functioning after all this time. Jake checked for threats and found none. No defense systems. No active weapons. No sign of any inhabitants. The city was empty but not dead. It was waiting. Daniel assembled the landing team in the shuttle bay. He would lead the mission personally along with Amy, Lisa, Kevin, Henry, and a squad of Marines including Corporal Beth Turner, who was the best sharpshooter in the unit. Lieutenant Chris Morgan would pilot the shuttle. They loaded equipment for exploration and excavation, weapons in case they encountered hostiles, medical supplies, recording devices to document everything they found. Henry brought translation software that he'd been developing for years based on fragments of ancient languages. The shuttle launched and descended through the atmosphere. Chris handled the controls with steady hands as turbulence rocked the small craft. The atmosphere seemed to respond to their presence. Patterns formed in the clouds around them. Energy readings spiked and faded. Nina's voice came over the comm from the Defiance, warning them about gravitational fluctuations. Chris adjusted course and brought them down in a wide spiral toward the largest structure in the city. They landed in a plaza that could have held 1,000 shuttles. The surface was smooth and unmarked by time. When they stepped out of the craft, the air was breathable and warm. Towers surrounded them on all sides, reaching up into the sky. The crystalline material they were built from hummed with faint vibrations. Henry ran his scanner over the nearest wall and gasped. The material was not stone or metal, but something organic. The entire city had been grown rather than built. Kevin deployed his Marines in a defensive perimeter, while the scientists began their work. Beth took position on a raised platform where she could watch for threats. The plaza was silent except for the wind and the strange humming from the towers. Daniel felt the weight of millions of years pressing down on this place. Civilizations had risen and fallen while these buildings stood unchanged. He wondered what had happened to the beings who built them. Henry found symbols carved into the plaza floor and began translating. The ancient language was complex, but his software could parse the basic meanings. The symbols told a story about those who came before. They called themselves the Shapers because they molded reality to their will. They had spanned the galaxy and brought order to chaos. They had been powerful beyond measure and wise beyond counting. But something had come from the darkness between stars, something that could not be shaped or controlled. It had destroyed them. Lisa studied biological samples from the crystalline structures. The readings confused her. The material was neither fully alive nor fully dead. It existed in some state between. She wondered if the Shapers themselves had been like this. Perhaps they had transcended flesh and become something else, something that could build cities that lasted forever, but could not defend against the thing that killed them. Amy detected a powerful energy source coming from the center of the city. She checked her readings 3 times to be sure. The power output was equivalent to a star. Whatever generated that much energy had to be important. Daniel decided they would head toward it. Henry agreed. He said the symbols pointed that way. They called it the archive, the place where knowledge was kept. The team moved through streets wide enough for vehicles that had never existed in human imagination. They passed buildings whose purposes they could only guess. Gardens filled with crystal plants that might once have been alive, fountains that no longer flowed, statues of beings that were beautiful and alien and sad. Henry recorded everything and spoke constantly into his recorder about what they were seeing. This was the discovery of a lifetime, and he wanted every detail preserved. They reached the center of the city where a massive structure rose higher than all the others. It was shaped like a spiral that seemed to go up forever. Energy pulsed through it in waves of light. The entrance was a doorway 3 times the height of a human. Symbols covered every surface. Henry translated them and said they were warnings. The archive was not meant for those who were unworthy. It would test anyone who entered. Only those with the right qualities could access the knowledge within. Daniel asked what qualities. Henry said the symbols mentioned courage, sacrifice, creativity, and unity. The Shapers had designed their archive to respond not to intelligence or strength, but to character. They wanted to ensure their knowledge only passed to races that would use it wisely. Daniel looked at his team and made the decision. They would enter. They had not come this far to turn back because of warnings. The doorway opened as they approached. Beyond it was a corridor that glowed with soft light. The walls showed images of the Shapers at the height of their civilization. They had been tall and graceful with forearms and faces that were almost human. The images showed their cities on 1,000 worlds, their ships traveling between stars, their joy in creation and discovery. Then the images changed. They showed darkness coming, stars going out, worlds dying, the Shapers fighting against something that could not be fought. Their final days as extinction approached. The corridor ended in a chamber so vast that Daniel could not see the far walls. In the center was a structure of pure crystal that pulsed with light and data. The archive. Henry approached it carefully and placed his hand on the surface. Information flooded into his mind so fast he cried out. Amy and Lisa caught him as he staggered. He said the archive was alive in a way. It was a stored consciousness of the Shapers. Their final gift to whoever came after. But the archive would not simply give its knowledge. It required tests, puzzles that measured the qualities the Shapers valued. The first puzzle appeared on the chamber walls. It was a complex pattern of energy and matter that had to be balanced. Amy studied it with her engineer's mind. She saw that it required understanding of physics beyond human knowledge. But it also required intuition, the ability to see patterns that were not obvious. She began making adjustments. Lisa helped by applying biological principles. She saw that the puzzle mimicked living systems. Energy flow like blood, information transfer like nerves. Together, they found solutions that neither could have discovered alone. The puzzle accepted their answer and a new one appeared. This one required understanding of alien psychology. Henry worked with Jake, who was watching from the Defiance over the comm link. They combined Henry's knowledge of ancient cultures with Jake's strategic thinking. The puzzle opened. Each test required different skills and different approaches. Daniel contributed tactical thinking. Kevin offered his direct combat experience, which surprisingly helped solve a puzzle about conflict resolution. Beth's precision and patience opened a lock that required absolute accuracy. Paul Grant's creative engineering from the ship helped Amy bypass a damaged section. Nina's navigation skills solved a puzzle about finding paths through chaos. Every member of the team contributed something essential. Hours passed as they worked through layer after layer of tests. The archive was teaching them as much as testing them. Each puzzle revealed new information about precursor technology. Weapon systems that could tear planets apart, engines that folded space, shields that could stop any attack, medical technology that could extend life for centuries, construction methods that could build cities in days. All of it was there waiting to be understood. But there was a price. Henry discovered it in the deeper files. The archive was connected to a network that spanned the galaxy. When they activated it, they sent a signal into deep space. The signal was a beacon calling to the thing that had destroyed the Shapers, the ancient enemy that dwelled in the darkness between stars. The tests were not just to prove worthiness. They were to prepare whoever accessed the archive for what would come next. Daniel demanded to know what they had awakened. Henry's face was pale as he translated the final warning. The Shapers called it the Void Born. It was older than stars and hungrier than black holes. It consumed civilizations not for resources but for the act of consuming. It had been dormant for millions of years, but the signal would wake it. It would come, and when it arrived, nothing could stop it. The Shapers had learned that truth too late. Before Daniel could process this information, Jake's voice crackled over the comm. Crithian ships had entered the system. The tactical display showed 50 Crithian warships in formation around the dying planet. The Defiance was alone and damaged with barely enough ammunition for a sustained fight. Daniel looked at the odds and knew they should run, but running meant the Crithians would chase them back to Sol. If he was going to die here, he would make it cost the enemy everything they had. Jake called out enemy positions and firing solutions. Amy prepared to push the engines beyond safe limits. The crew waited for orders they knew might be their last. Admiral Coleman's voice came through the comm from Europa. He ordered Daniel to retreat immediately. The archive data was too important to lose. If Daniel died here, humanity's last hope died with him. But Daniel was already calculating angles and trajectories. He saw something the Admiral could not see from across the galaxy. The Crithian formation had a weakness. They were overconfident. They thought one human ship posed no real threat. Daniel told the Admiral he was staying. He cut the comm before Coleman could argue further. He looked at his crew and saw no fear in their faces, only determination. They had all accepted that this mission would probably kill them. What mattered now was making their deaths count for something. Amy reported that she was ready to implement some of the precursor technology from the archive. It was untested and might explode, but she thought it would work. Daniel told her to do it. In engineering, Amy and Paul worked faster than they had ever worked before. They were installing shield generators based on designs that were millions of years old. The archive data included schematics and equations that made human physics look primitive. Amy understood maybe 10% of what she was reading, but that 10% was enough. Paul fabricated components from materials they had on hand. It should not work, but desperation made engineers creative. The shields came online and the ship's hull began to glow with a faint blue light. Jake ran diagnostics and reported that their defensive capacity had increased by 300%. It still was not enough to survive concentrated fire from 50 enemy ships, but it was better than nothing. Amy already was working on the weapons systems. The archive contained information about energy, manipulation that could turn their remaining missiles into something far more dangerous. The Crethian fleet finished its bombardment of the planet and turned toward the Defiance. The enemy commander sent a transmission demanding surrender. Daniel ignored it. He was watching Nina plot their course through the enemy formation. She had found a path that would take them through the debris field where the larger Crithian ships would have trouble maneuvering. It was insane, but most of what humans did seemed insane to aliens who could not understand creative thinking. The battle began when the Defiance suddenly accelerated toward the enemy fleet, instead of away. The Crithians hesitated for just a moment in confusion. That moment was enough. Nina threaded the ship through a gap in their formation. Jake fired enhanced missiles that tore through 3 enemy vessels. The precursor technology made human weapons hit like lightning from angry gods. The Crithians scrambled to adjust their tactics, but the human ship was already past them. Daniel used the planet's gravity well as a slingshot and sent the Defiance on an arc that brought them up behind the Crithian flagship. The enemy shields were oriented forward to protect against the attack they expected. The rear was vulnerable. Jake fired everything they had. The flagship shuddered under the impacts. Its reactor went critical and exploded in a ball of plasma that consumed 2 nearby cruisers. The Crithian formation broke apart in chaos, but the Defiance could not escape. Too many enemy ships surrounded them. The battle became a desperate fight for survival measured in seconds. Amy rerouted power constantly, shields to port as 3 ships fired from that direction, engines to starboard to avoid a collision, weapons forward to clear a path. The ship was not designed for this kind of stress. Systems were failing faster than Paul could repair them. On the bridge, the crew fought with coordination born from months of combat. Nina predicted enemy movements before they happened. Jake fired weapons before targets appeared on sensors. Lisa had abandoned the medical bay and was helping manage power distribution. Henry stayed at his station analyzing the archive data, looking for anything else that might help. Everyone did 3 jobs at once, and somehow it worked. A Crithian heavy cruiser managed to land a solid hit on the port side. The shields held but barely. The impact threw people against bulkheads. Alarms screamed about hull breaches. Kevin led damage control teams through burning corridors to seal the leaks. His Marines worked in vacuum with emergency patches and welding equipment. They saved sections of the ship that should have been lost. Daniel saw that they could not win this fight through firepower alone. The Crithians had too many ships. He needed to change the game. He ordered Nina to plot a collision course with the largest enemy battleship. She stared at him in shock. He repeated the order. She entered the commands with shaking hands. The Defiance turned toward the massive Crithian vessel and accelerated. The enemy saw what was happening and panicked. They concentrated all fire on the human ship, trying to destroy it before the collision. The shields held through sheer force of will and Amy's constant adjustments. The battleship tried to turn away, but it was too massive to maneuver quickly. At the last possible second, Daniel ordered Nina to engage the micro-jump drive that let them move short distances through hyperspace. It was dangerous to jump so close to gravity wells, but danger was relative now. The Defiance vanished from normal space for half a second and reappeared on the far side of the Crithian formation. The enemy ships that had been firing at them hit their own battleship instead. The combined barrage tore through shields and armor. The battleship broke apart in sections. Secondary explosions rippled through a third of the enemy fleet. Daniel had turned their own firepower against them. The Crithian commander realized he was fighting an opponent who did not follow any logical tactical doctrine. Human combat strategy was based on chaos and improvisation. Every time the aliens predicted what the humans would do, they were wrong. It was like fighting shadows. The commander tried to regroup his forces, but Daniel pressed the attack. He knew the only way to survive was to break the enemy's will. For 6 hours, the battle raged across the system. The Defiance could not be destroyed and could not be predicted. It danced through enemy formations. It appeared where it should not be. It fought like something alive and angry. The crew operated beyond exhaustion. Amy fell asleep at her station and Paul took over. Jake's hands were bleeding from gripping the controls too hard. Lisa treated injuries while suffering from her own. The ship was held together by determination and improvisation. Finally, the Crithian fleet withdrew. They had lost 17 ships and the survivors were damaged. The human vessel was still fighting. The enemy commander had never seen anything like it. He sent one more transmission offering a ceasefire if the humans left the system. Daniel accepted. He had no choice. The Defiance was barely functional. They had no ammunition left. The crew was at the breaking point. The Crithians pulled back and the Defiance limped toward open space. Behind them, the planet that held the ancient ruins was now a crater-filled wasteland. The city that had stood for millions of years was gone, but the knowledge had been saved. Amy secured the archive data in redundant storage systems. Henry began the long process of translating and understanding it. The information was vast beyond measure. The ship jumped to hyperspace on the last of its fuel reserves. They had no destination except away. The crew collapsed at their stations. Kevin and his Marines conducted a head count. They had lost 23 people during the battle. Kevin himself had stayed behind on the planet to hold the landing zone. Daniel had watched him die along with Beth Turner and 5 other Marines who refused to leave their sergeant. Their sacrifice had bought the time needed for the shuttle to escape. Daniel stood on the bridge looking at the star field and thinking about the people they had lost. Every name was carved into his memory. Every face was a ghost that would haunt him. But they had accomplished the mission. Against impossible odds, they had retrieved the archive and survived. Now came the harder part. They had to get home and somehow use this knowledge to save humanity. Lisa brought her report about the Crithian prisoners they still held from the nebula. She had been studying them throughout the journey. Her findings were revolutionary. The Crithians were not evil. They were not monsters. They were a civilization bound by rigid social structures that could not adapt to chaos. When they encountered humanity, they had no framework for understanding. Humans were random variables in equations that should have only one answer. That made humans dangerous in ways the Crithians could not calculate. Jake proposed a strategy based on Lisa's findings. If the Crithians could not handle unpredictability, then humanity needed to be as chaotic as possible. Fight in ways that made no tactical sense. Use technology in combinations that should not work. Refuse to follow any pattern. Make every battle unique. Force the enemy to face the one thing they could not defend against, which was the unknown. The more Daniel thought about it, the more he saw the wisdom. The precursor technology gave them tools, but humanity's real weapon was its nature. The Helix Nebula appeared on the view screen like a massive spiral of colored gas stretching across space. Somewhere inside was the precursor shipyard. The Defiance approached carefully with sensors scanning for threats. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. The shipyard was a structure the size of a small moon. Construction bays large enough to build battleships. Automated systems that had waited millions of years for someone to return. It was still functional and still generating power from sources that defied human understanding. Daniel ordered the crew to extreme caution as they approached. The facility might have defensive systems, but as they drew closer, Henry detected a recognition signal from the archive data. The shipyard identified the Defiance as carrying precursor authorization. Docking bay doors opened in welcome. It was like coming home to a house that had been waiting for you forever. They docked and explored the massive station with growing wonder. Production lines sat ready to begin work. Raw materials were stored in quantities that could build 100 fleets. Fabricators that could create complex components from base elements. The shipyard was a self-contained industrial civilization. Amy wanted to stay and study everything. Paul walked through the engineering sections with his mouth open in shock. This one facility could change everything for humanity. But they were not alone for long. Jake detected ships entering the nebula. Crithian scouts had found them. Within hours, a fleet would arrive. Daniel faced an impossible situation. The shipyard could not be moved and could not be defended with one ship. He sent an emergency transmission to Admiral Coleman at Europa. He gave the coordinates and begged for every ship humanity had left. This was the place to make their final stand. Coleman's response came hours later. He was bringing the fleet. Every operational vessel from Europa, and the few survivors from other bases. It would take them 5 days to arrive. Daniel had to hold the shipyard until then. With one ship against an enemy fleet that would keep growing as more Crithians responded to their calls for reinforcement. The odds were worse than impossible, but Daniel had stopped caring about odds. He put the crew to work immediately. Amy figured out how to activate the shipyard's automated defenses. Ancient weapon platforms came online around the facility. They were orders of magnitude more powerful than anything humans or Crithians possessed. Jake integrated them into a defensive network. The shipyard would not fall easily. Meanwhile, Paul and his engineering team began bringing the production lines online. Henry had translated enough of the archive to operate the basic functions. They started with the simplest designs, small fighters that could be built in hours. Then larger vessels. The fabricators worked at speeds that seemed magical. In 2 days, they had produced 20 fighters and 5 corvettes, each one equipped with precursor technology. The new ships needed pilots and crew. Daniel called for volunteers from the Defiance. Chris Morgan took command of the 1st Fighter Squadron. Nina Walsh agreed to pilot a corvette after giving someone a crash course in her navigation duties. Volunteers stepped forward for every position. Young technicians became ship captains overnight. Medical staff became gunners. Everyone did whatever was needed because there was no one else to do it. On the 3rd day, the Crethean fleet arrived. 30 warships dropped out of hyperspace and moved to attack. But they found something they did not expect. The shipyard was defended by ancient weapons and a small fleet of hybrid vessels. The Cretheans attacked anyway. They had their orders. Destroy the humans and the facility. The battle began with the shipyard's weapon platforms firing first. Beams of coherent energy lanced across space and punched through Crethean shields like they were paper. 3 enemy ships died in the opening salvo. The rest scattered and tried to find approaches that avoided the platforms. That was when Chris and his fighters struck. They were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Cretheans could field. They hit and ran using tactics Chris made up as he went. Daniel coordinated the defense from the Defiance. Jake fed him tactical data from hundreds of sensors. Amy kept the shipyard systems running, while simultaneously directing the construction of more vessels. New ships were launching every few hours. Some had crews. Some were automated drones programmed with basic combat routines. The Cretheans were facing a shipyard that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them, but the enemy kept coming. More fleets arrived throughout the 4th day. The Cretheans were committing major resources to this fight. They recognized the threat the shipyard represented. If the humans gained access to precursor production capabilities, the war would turn in humanity's favor. The aliens could not allow that. The fighting became constant and brutal. Ships on both sides were lost. Chris died when his fighter took a direct hit, and he refused to eject, instead ramming the enemy ship that had killed 2 of his pilots. Nina's corvette was crippled, and she had to evacuate her crew before it exploded. Casualties mounted on both sides. The space around the shipyard became a graveyard of wreckage and debris. On the 5th day, Admiral Coleman arrived with the human fleet. 28 ships jumped into the system. Every vessel humanity could spare. Every crew member who could fight. They were outnumbered 3-1 by the Crethean forces, but they had precursor technology and desperation. Coleman took tactical command of the fleet while Daniel continued coordinating the shipyard defenses. The battle reached a new intensity. Human ships fought with coordination and creativity that the Cretheans could not match. Coleman used asteroid fields and debris as weapons. His ships appeared in unexpected places. They fought in ways that made no tactical sense but worked anyway. The Cretheans tried to adapt, but every time they thought they understood human strategy, it changed. Amy made a breakthrough with the shipyard systems. She found the template for a precursor dreadnought, a ship that could match entire fleets. The construction would take 12 hours, but once complete it would change the balance of power. She initiated the build sequence and prayed they could hold long enough to finish it. Then something happened that no one expected. A new signal appeared on sensors. Ships dropping out of hyperspace, but they were not Crethean. The energy signatures were unknown and massive. The entire battle paused as both sides tried to identify the newcomers. Henry checked the signals against the archive data, and his face went pale. The Voidborn had arrived. The entity was not a single ship, but a swarm of vessels that seemed to be made of darkness itself. They moved through space in patterns that hurt to watch. Where they passed, energy was drained and matter decayed. The precursor warning had been true. The archive signal had awakened something ancient and hungry. It had come to feed. The Voidborn attacked both fleets without distinction. Crethean ships tried to defend themselves, but their weapons had no effect. Human vessels fared no better. The entity was immune to conventional warfare. It absorbed energy attacks. It ignored kinetic impacts. It was death-given form, and nothing could stop it. Daniel watched in horror as ships on both sides were torn apart. The Voidborn stripped them down to their atoms and consumed everything. Crews died in seconds. Entire vessels vanished into the darkness. This was what had destroyed the precursors. This was the enemy that could not be fought. Then something unexpected happened. The Crethean flagship sent a transmission on all frequencies. Admiral Zreth offered an alliance. The enemy of both races had arrived. Fighting each other while the Voidborn killed them all was suicide. Humanity and the Crithian Dominion had to unite or perish together. It was the first time in the war that the aliens had suggested anything other than human extinction. Daniel looked at Coleman. The Admiral looked back. They had seconds to decide. Trust the aliens who had been trying to kill them for decades or face the Voidborn alone. Daniel remembered what Lisa had learned about Crithian psychology. They could not lie effectively. Their rigid thinking made deception difficult. If Zreth was offering alliance, he meant it. Coleman gave the order. Humanity accepted. The combined fleet coordinated their efforts for the first time. Human tactical creativity combined with Crithian firepower. Daniel directed both fleets while Zreth contributed his strategic knowledge. They found that the Voidborn could be hurt by precursor weapons. The ancient race had created defenses against their killer. The weapons were integrated into both human and Crithian ships. Amy worked with Crithian engineers sharing technology that had been secrets hours before. The dreadnought completed construction and launched into battle. It was a massive vessel crewed by volunteers from both races, humans and Crithians working side by side. The ship's weapons tore into the Voidborn with devastating effect. For the first time, the entity showed something like pain. It began to withdraw, but it was not defeated. The entity pulled back its swarm, but it did not leave. It waited in the dark space beyond the nebula. Henry analyzed its behavior and understood. The Voidborn was studying them, learning. It would return stronger, but for now there was a reprieve. The battle ended with both fleets battered but intact. Crithian and human ships floated side by side. The crews looked at each other across communication channels. Former enemies who had fought together against something worse. Zreth sent another transmission. He proposed a formal cease.